Okay, so we were talking about the island hopping in the Pacific, and we just got done with the Battle of the Leyte Gulf, which was the most important and the biggest naval battle in history with regard to number of participants, area covered, and the number of ships involved. So now let's leave the Pacific for a moment and go back to the European front. So now we're looking at the Atlantic Ocean and the fight over the control of this important waterway. So both the Allied and the Axis powers need to receive their supplies by water to a great extent. They need to be able to move their troops and their naval support ships freely. And so both of them are fighting over control of the Atlantic Ocean. The Allied powers want to try to block the Axis powers and their sea movements and protect their commerce, especially in the beginning, especially with the United States. And then later on, when the United States enters the war, obviously it will be critical for the United States to have control over the Atlantic Ocean as well in order to bring troops to Europe as well as supplies. The Axis obviously want to block this flow of first supplies. If we remember, the United States, even before entering the war, was sending a lot of supplies to Great Britain, and also was sending supplies then to the Soviet Union when Germany turned on the Soviet Union and invaded with Operation Barbarossa. So they're trying to cut off this supply route and basically paralyze Great Britain, which is the last real standing country in Europe that's facing Germany, and therefore basically starve Great Britain from military supplies as well as supplies for the sustenance of the people. Being an island nation, they're very dependent upon the sea. And in the beginning of this struggle over the Atlantic, the British Navy, the most important and most powerful navy in the world up to this point, was holding its own against the German Navy's attempt to blockade the island of England. However, this took a radical turn when, in May of 1940, the Axis powers blast through the Low Countries and Belgium and eventually conquer France. Italy enters the war, and this gives Germany the advantage of now having a whole series of ports right on the Atlantic Ocean. This steps up their U-boat attacks on British and American ships in the Atlantic, and they become dramatically successful in their attacks, making a significant impact on the Allied trade routes. They also launched a number of very important battleships that tried to take out a number of British battleships. The Bismarck was the most well known, the most famous, the largest battleship in Europe, and successfully took out some British battleships when it faced off. However, the Bismarck was sunk in May of 1941, and then the United States came into the war that December, and so again there was a change of winds, if you will, and there were a number of things apart from the United States entering the war. Also, the Allies made great progress in their radar equipment, in their penetration again of the U-boat codes, so they knew where the U-boats were going to be. They could read their codes and their messages, and they also improved their patrol aircraft, so it was able to go a lot further away and search for the U-boats. And eventually the numbers started turning, and the Allies took control again and started sinking a lot of German U-boats, to the point that Germany could no longer continue their U-boat war against the Allies and their commerce in the Atlantic. So again, by 1943, the Allies had control of the Atlantic Ocean. And so that would be marking the end of this long, drawn-out battle for the Seaway. The next most important battle to consider would be in the Eastern Front, where Hitler, after failing to take Moscow, decides, instead of reattacking Moscow, he decides to turn his troops towards Stalingrad because of its very influential, important role in industry and transportation with regard to military supplies. And so Stalingrad becomes the scene of the largest, longest, and bloodiest engagement in modern warfare. So it's a very famous, or I should say infamous, battle because of its gruesome, long, drawn-out, hand-to-hand, house-to-house combat. Some of this was inspired by the fact that Hitler made it known that when the Germans took Stalingrad, all of the males would be shot and the women would be deported. Essentially, this puts the Soviets in a state of fear, but also in a state of defiance, in the sense that they have nothing to lose. So apart from the fact that Stalin ordered every person capable of holding a gun to take up arms, it became that even the civilians of the city were fighting from house to house, tooth and nail, and would fight to the very last, if that's what it took, to save the city. Stalin ordered that the city must be held at all costs, while Hitler ordered that the city must be taken at all costs. Eventually, Soviet forces were able to send reinforcements, and they were able to surround the city. So Soviets were in the city fighting the Germans in the city, house to house. But then Soviet forces surrounded the city and were able to trap 300,000 Germans in the city of Stalingrad. And they took advantage of the cold winter that set in, and they basically starved the Germans to death. The Germans made a number of efforts to try to relieve their trapped soldiers in Stalingrad, but the Soviets held out, and eventually the Germans gave up on the soldiers that were trapped there and declared the city to be lost. This was the first major defeat that Hitler actually recognized in the war. And this battle was so significant because it was the major turning point on the Eastern Front, putting the Axis powers on the defensive and the Soviets marching on the offensive, and became a turning point for the entire war in Europe. Now, if you remember, we had mentioned the fact that Italy had decided to invade Egypt and was trying to expand their influence in North Africa and also take over the control of the Suez Canal. But that they had been unsuccessful against the British forces there, and that Germany had to come to their aid. In fact, now this is what we call the North Africa Campaign. It was a long, drawn-out campaign between September 1940 and May of 1943. The important key players in this campaign would be the German general, Rommel, who was famous for his tank wars and his abilities in that realm. And you'll remember that he is also the general who was in charge of the defenses along the coast of France when we have D-Day. So this is Rommel in his position in North Africa before he gets sent to defend against D-Day. So we'll remember him from James's presentation. So the Axis powers obviously want to have control of oil supplies, to control also the Suez Canal, and to basically have the whole of North Africa under their influence to be able to also control the Mediterranean. So this is their main thrust. But at first, Rommel is successful in helping the Italians and basically the Germans take over the offensive. And he is successful up until the point of the Battle of El Alamein, where the British actually are able to stop the advance of Rommel, who was going at lightning speed with their traditional blitzkrieg across North Africa with his tanks. Then Operation Torch, which is led by the Americans, is the attempt to take back the territory gained by Rommel. And the general that's in charge of the American forces is Eisenhower, but his tank commander, who's actually well known for his strategy, is General George S. Patton. And so we basically have a face-off between Patton and Rommel. And the British general is Bernard Montgomery, who's the most famous British general fighting in North Africa at the time. They are successful against Rommel after a number of back and forths of taking territory and losing territory. They eventually outgun him and pin him into a corner until he has to be evacuated with his last troops from North Africa, and it falls in May of 1943. So with the fall of North Africa, apart from the serious losses that the Germans sustained, this allows and paves the way for the Allied powers to then not only take over the Mediterranean Sea, control of the Mediterranean, but also then eventually invade Sicily and come up the Italian mainland. So this is the project for the summer of 1943, immediately after the fall of North Africa. And that leads us to the invasion of Italy. Actually, my grandfather, my father's father, fought under George S. Patton and went all the way across North Africa in the coming and going of the wins and losses. He then hopped over to Sicily. Then he came up to Salerno, and he was in artillery. And they moved up to Monte Cassino, and then went through Rome, and finally he actually stopped in Florence. And he stayed there for about a year, helping out the local businesses and reconstructing after the war. So that was some of these events. I've had, personal stories that have come from my grandfather about this, and of course also many of these events, Mother Lepoy, Mother Rosa, and Mother Gina all lived through these times, and so they've got some incredible stories too of this invasion of Italy. So the Allied powers jump from North Africa to Sicily, and they actually are able to land on Sicily without much difficulty. When they take Sicily, the government of Mussolini falls apart, and then a new government under Marshal Pietro Badoglio takes over, and they start secret negotiation with the Allies. So Italy's preparing itself to switch sides in the war, which is incredibly detrimental to the Italian population because the Germans are all over in Italy. So you basically have your enemies in your backyard, you have your enemy in your house, and from one day to the other to go from friend to enemy is incredibly difficult for the Italian people. So they land in Sicily, take over Sicily pretty quickly, and then they hop over to Salerno, as I said. And they land at Salerno, and then the U.S. also lands at Anzio beachhead in January of 1944. From these points, they face up against the Gustav Line, which is it's a 100-mile line of fortifications, German fortifications, from one side of Italy to the other. You can kind of see it on the map here. It's at the line of Cassino. So Monte Cassino is a strategic mountaintop point where obviously there's the Benedictine monastery, but it's also used now as a stronghold for the German forces. And they're not able to get through this line, the Allied powers, and finally they completely bombard Monte Cassino, and they bomb it, and the artillery just blows it to smithereens. And my grandfather said that he contributed to that destruction of Monte Cassino, and it really it made an incredible impression upon him. But once that had been destroyed, they broke through the Gustav Line, and they came up to Rome. Rome was surrendered by the Germans without a battle. Both sides recognized the importance of the Eternal City, and they knew that if they fought over it, that it would be completely destroyed and there'd be nothing left of it. The Germans realized that they would not be able to hold it anyway, and so they left the city peacefully, thankfully, and they went north and they held the line now at the Gothic line. And you can see the Gothic line stretching across the top of Italy there, and that was the line where they tried to hold off the Allied powers from eventually coming up into Germany. And they held off there up until August of 1944. And then in April 28th, Mussolini is captured by the partisans and executed, and his body is hung upside down in shame. And then it brings us to another very unfortunate moment in the war for both the Allies and the Axis powers. A phenomenon that we call carpet bombing. Technically, carpet bombing is where you strategically bomb an entire city, essentially, or an entire zone of a city, without caring for where exactly you're going to be dropping the bombs. So it wasn't targeting specific buildings or specific infrastructure. It was just laying down bombs. You can see the bombers there in the picture that I show here, and how there's just bombs that are just falling out of the airplanes. And so obviously they're reducing to rubble entire cities or entire areas of cities, like you see in the picture next to the title. Both sides of the war, both Allies and Axis powers, used this method. It's morally, obviously, considered wrong, because you're essentially attacking civilian targets. You're indiscriminately killing large populations of cities. They would indicate military targets usually. They would indicate certain cities that were strategically important because of their industry or because of their infrastructure. They were essential to the war effort. There was one exception to this, particular exception, and that would be the firebombing of Dresden. Dresden was a smaller city in Germany that had no strategic or military value. It was just a city of civilians, and it was completely obliterated, completely bombed. And the idea was mainly to destroy the morale of the opposing country. Obviously, it's immoral to do something like this. You're not fighting the military. You're fighting and killing civilians who are unarmed for the most part. So this is a sad chapter in World War II, but as we know, in all wars, there are always sad chapters where the civilians take a great toll in the war, and this is the chapter in World War II. Then we have the Tehran Conference, which is basically a get-together between the big three, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, to decide what's the next plan to bring down Hitler. So they meet up and they actually plan and organize Operation Overlord, which, as you remember, is James's presentation, so that's D-Day. And they plan it for June of 1944. But they're talking in November of 1943, so it's almost a year ahead of time. And they figure it out, what they want to do, what their plan is. Stalin's going to keep on pressing from the east, and then Churchill and Roosevelt get together and they decide to place Eisenhower as the chief of operations for Operation Overlord. And they meet up separately in Cairo, and he is set for D-Day. So, Operation Overlord, James gave us a very good presentation of this incredible invasion, the most important and the largest amphibious landing in history, and obviously a turning point on the Western Front in the war. And so just remember the false Pas de Calais landing, so they tried to trick the Germans. Make sure you know the beaches, and know that Omaha Beach was the most important beach. It was overtaken by the Americans, but at a high cost, whereas the other beaches were a lot easier for them to take over. Rommel, the great commander from North Africa, was not there personally to lead the tank forces to run to the aid of the Atlantic Wall that was supposed to defend against such an invasion. Rommel was actually at home because there was bad weather, and he thought that there was no chance of an invasion at this time of the year, and so he was at home in Germany visiting his family. And so the Germans were very much caught by surprise, and they were overrun, but not without inflicting great losses on the Allied powers, and also delaying very much their entrance into France. They were pretty much held at the beach for quite a long time, and it took a lot of men and the loss of a lot of lives to push themselves out from the beach. Matter of fact, it took a long time for them to gain territory in France. If you remember, I said the British tried 4 times just to take the city of Caen, and an idea came up that they would try to basically bypass the major German force that was still holding the line at the Siegfried Line, and they would drop paratroopers behind the German lines and try to capture a number of the bridges along the Rhine so that they could sweep past the Germans and come around them and basically cut off their access back to Germany. However, the airborne troops were not all able to get to the bridges, and the most important was the Arnhem Bridge, and it is now known as the Bridge Too Far because they just couldn't quite make it. And they've made a number of films about this Operation Market Garden, which was a great failure and led to a lot of Allied losses and casualties. The last great battle, if you will, before the Allies make it into Germany and push through the German lines would be the Battle of the Bulge. It's also known as the Battle of the Ardennes. So here we are again in the Ardennes forest. Remember, the Germans had come across into France through this forest, and now the Allies are pushing the Germans back, and the Allies make a huge bulge. They bulge out. There's a big group of Allies that pushes in through the German lines, and that's why it's called the Battle of the Bulge. It lasts for 6 weeks in the winter, so it's horrible fighting conditions, and it's an extremely cold winter, and there are great losses. Matter of fact, this is the costliest battle for the Americans in the European front. The Americans in this one battle lose over 100,000 casualties. But it's the last big battle, which in the end the Allies win, and only 5 months later Germany will completely surrender. So back to the Pacific. And I think I'm going to stop here because I'll cut the video in two so it's easier to upload. So we'll take back up with the Battle of the Pacific with the Battle of Iwo Jima. So I'll pick it up later.